Good evening. I hope everyone's doing well tonight. Tonight we are going to read through chapter 32 of David Copperfield by Charles Dickens. If this is your first time watching, this is not a typical reading. We are going to stop and talk about interesting vocabulary words as we read through. And maybe I'll stop to explain certain expressions or phrases that we encounter. If you're watching this live, then I encourage you to ask questions in the chat if you have questions about a particular word or phrase that we encounter. If you don't, then I will just stop sometimes when I find something that I think might be useful or interesting for you. All right, well, let's get started with chapter 32 of David Copperfield by Charles Dickens, which is called The Beginning of a Long Journey. What is natural in me is natural in many other men. I infer, and so I am not afraid to write, that I never had loved Steerforth better than when the ties that bound me to him were broken. In the keen distress of the discovery of his unworthiness, I thought more of all that was brilliant in him. I softened more towards all that was good in him. I did more justice to the qualities that might have made him a man of noble, mature, and great name than ever I had done in the height of my devotion to him. If this is your first time watching, this is a very long story. But Davy's very best friend, Steerforth, it was discovered, ran away with a girl. And that alone is very, very scandalous 170 years ago. A big problem. But this was an even bigger problem because he ran away with a girl who was just about to be married to a different man. And to make things even worse, he's very rich and she's very poor. So that's a huge problem back then. And an even bigger problem is that this girl is a very, very good friend of, or Davy is very good friends with the family of the girl. So it's a huge conflict for him because Steerforth is his best friend who he loves very much. But he's done this horrible thing to someone whose family he knows very, very well. So it's quite a pickle. Deeply as I had felt my own unconscious part in his pollution of an honest home, I believed that if I had been brought face to face with him, I could not have uttered one reproach. And we've seen that word reproach before, which means you're doing something bad, you're doing something wrong. So Davy is thinking, even if I saw him right now, I don't think I could reproach him. I don't think I could say, that was a bad thing that you did. I should have loved him so well still. Though he fascinated me no longer, I should have held in so much tenderness the memory of my affection for him, that I think I should never have been as weak as a spirit, wounded child, in all but the entertainment of a thought that we could ever be reunited. That thought I never had. I felt, as he had felt, that all was at an end between us. What his remembrances of me were, I have never known. They were light enough, perhaps, and easily dismissed. But mine of him were as the remembrances of a cherished friend who is dead. Yes, Steerforth, long removed from the scenes of this poor history, my sorrow may bear involuntary witness against you at the judgment throne, but my angry thoughts or my reproaches never will, I know. The news of what had happened soon spread through the town, insomuch that as I passed along the streets the next morning, I overheard the people speaking of it at their doors. Many were hard upon her. Some few were hard upon him, but towards her second father and her lover there was but one sentiment. Among all kinds of people, a respect for them in their distress prevailed. So Emily, the girl who ran away with him, the people of the town were saying very horrible things about her. But it's pretty funny that they didn't have the same things to say about Steerforth. And maybe that's because he is a very rich, important man. So it wasn't easy for them to say negative things about him. But it was very easy for them to say things about Emily, the girl who was very poor and ran away with him. Among all kinds of people, a respect for them in their distress prevailed, which was full of gentleness and delicacy. The seafaring men kept apart when those two were seen early, walking with slow steps on the beach, and stood in knots, talking compassionately among themselves. It was on the beach, close down by the sea, that I found them. It would have been easy to perceive that they had not slept all last night. Even Peggotty had failed to tell me of their still sitting just as I left them. When it was broad day, they looked worn, and I thought Mr. Peggotty's head was bowed in one night more than all the years I had seen him. Oh, that's a little bit complicated. I'm not sure what that means. They looked worn, so they looked tired, very tired and worried. And I thought Mr. Peggotty's head was bowed in one night more. Was bowed in one night more than in all the... Okay, bowed in, like maybe his head was very low. Because to bow is like this. So his head being bowed in, meaning looking sad, because Mr. Peggotty is never sad. He's always very happy. But they were both as grave and steady as the sea itself. Then, lying in a dark sky, waveless, yet with a heavy roll upon it, as if it breathed in its rest, and touched on the horizon, with a strip of silvery light from the unseen sun. "We had a mort of talk, sir," said Mr. Peggotty to me, when we had all three walked a little while in silence, of what we ought and don't ought to do. But we see our course now. I happened to glance at Ham, then looking out to sea upon the distant light, and a frightful thought came into my mind. Not that this face was angry, for it was not. I recall nothing but an expression of stern determination in it, that if ever he encountered Steerforth, he would kill him. "My duty here, sir," said Mr. Peggotty, "is done. I'm going to seek my..." He stopped and went on in a firmer voice. "I'm going to seek her. That's my duty evermore." Emily is his niece, but I think that he thinks of her as his daughter. So I think he was about to say, "I'm going to seek my daughter," but he stopped because really she's his niece. And then he just changed the words. "I'm going to seek her." He shook his head when I asked him where he would seek her, and I inquired if I were going to London tomorrow, I told him I had not gone today, fearing to lose the chance of being of any service to him, but that I was ready to go when he would. "I'll go along with you, sir," he rejoined, "if you're agreeable tomorrow." We walked again for a while, in silence. "Ham," he presently resumed, "he'll hold to his present work, and go live along with my sister, the old boat yonder." "Will you desert the old boat, Mr. Peggotty?" I gently interposed. "My station, Master Davy," he returned, "ain't there no longer, and if ever a boat foundered since there was darkness on the face of the deep, that one's going down. But no, sir, no. I don't mean it as it should be deserted. Fur from that." We walked again for a little while as before, until he explained. "My wishes is, sir, as it shall look day and night, winter and summer, as it has always looked since she fust knowed it. If ever she should come a-wandering back, I wouldn't have the old place seem to cast her off, you understand, but seem to tempt her, to draw her nigher, to peep nigher toot, I don't know, and to peep in, maybe like a ghost, out of the wind and rain, through the old winder, at the old seat by the fire. Then, maybe, Master Davy, seeing none but Miss Gummidge there, she might take heart to creep in." Creeping in is going in very quietly, very slowly. So he's saying, I want the boat, the house, to be there so that if she comes by, of course, she wouldn't try to walk in the door. She would be too scared and too ashamed of what she's done. But maybe she'll peep through the window. And Ham and Mr. Peggotty will be gone, so if she only sees Mrs. Gummidge there, maybe she would be tempted to walk inside, to creep, to go very quietly inside. She might take heart to creep in, trembling, and might come to be laid down in her old bed, and rest her weary head where it was once so gay. I could not speak to him in reply, though I tried. "Every night," said Mr. Peggotty, "as regular as the night comes, the candle must be stood up in its old pane of glass, that if ever she should see it, it may seem to say, 'Come back, my child, come back.' If ever there's a knock, Ham, particular, a soft knock, arter dark, at your aunt's door, don't you go nigh it. Let it be her, not you, that sees my fallen child." He walked a little in front of us, and kept before us for some minutes. During this interval, I glanced at Ham again, and observing the same expression on his face, and his eyes still directed in the distant light, I touched his arm. Twice I called him by his name, in the tone in which I might have tried to rouse a sleeper, before he heeded me. That word heed means to pay attention, so before he paid attention to me. When I at last inquired on what his thoughts were so bent, he replied, "Oh, what's afore me, Mas'r Davy, and over yon, on the life before you, do you mean? On the life before you, do you mean?" He had pointed confusedly out to sea. "Aye, Master Davy, I don't rightly know how 'tis, but over yon there seemed to me to come the end of it, like looking at me as if he were waking, but with the same determined face." "What end?" I asked, possessed by my former fear. "I don't know," he said thoughtfully. I was calling to mind that the beginning of it all did take place here, and then the end come. but it's gone. Master Davy," he added, answering, as I think my look, "you ha'n't no call to be afeard o' me. I'm kinder muddled. I don't fare to feel no matters," which was as much to say as he was not himself, and quite confounded. So Ham is speaking in a very regional sort of way, which is difficult to understand. So even Davy is translating this. He says he was kind of saying he's not himself right now, and he's a little bit confused. Mr. Peggotty, stopping for us to join him, we did so, and said no more. The remembrance of this in connection with my former thought, however, haunted me at intervals, even until the inexorable end came at its appointed time. We sensibly approached the old boat and entered Miss Gummidge, no longer moping in her special corner. Moping is when you're depressed and you're just sitting there. That's moping. And Mrs. Gummidge is always depressed, so she's always sitting there, moping. Mrs. Gummidge was busy preparing breakfast. She took Mr. Peggotty's hat and placed his seat for him, and spoke so comfortably and softly that I hardly knew her. So she's always very depressed and in a very bad mood because she's had a horrible life. And the reason she lives there is because Mr. Peggotty, she had nowhere to go. She was going to live on the street because her husband died. But Mr. Peggotty took her into his home. But she's always sitting in the living room, in the parlor, the living room, whatever, moping, very depressed. She never has anything nice to say. But when Emily ran away, she suddenly realized she has to cheer up and be supportive to Mr. Peggotty, who's taken care of her for such a long time. She has to try her best, even if she doesn't feel to be happy, to try to be more cheerful and treat him well. And Davy's saying, it's so weird to see her walking around doing things. I didn't even think it was Mrs. Gummidge. "Daniel, my good man," she said, "you must eat and drink and keep up your strength, for without it you'll do naught. Try, that's a dear soul. And if I disturb you with my clicketin'," she meant her chattering. Chattering is just talking. "Tell me so, Daniel, and I won't." When she had served us all, she withdrew to the window, where she sedulously employed herself in repairing some shirts and other clothes belonging to Mr. Peggotty, and neatly folding and packing them in an old oilskin bag such as sailors carry. Meanwhile, she continued talking in the same quiet manner. "All times and seasons, you know, Daniel," said Mrs. Gummidge. "I shall be, alas, here." Alas, maybe? I shall be alas here. And I don't know that alas word. I don't know what that means. "And everything will look accordin' to your wishes. I'm a poor scholar, but I shall write to you odd times, and when you're away, and send my letters to Master Davy. Maybe you'll write to me too, Daniel, odd times, and tell me how you fare, and fare to feel upon your lorn journeys." "You'll be a solitary woman here, I'm afeard," said Mr. Peggotty. No, Daniel," she returned, "I shan't be that. Don't you mind me. I shall have enough to do to keep a bein' for you." Mrs. Gummidge meant at home. "Again you come back. Keep a bein' here for any that may hap to come back. Daniel, in the fine time, I shall set outside the door, as I used to. If any should come nigh, they shall see the old widder woman, true to 'em, a long way off." What a change in Mrs. Gummidge in a little time! She was another woman. She was so devoted. She had such a quick perception of what it would be so well to say and what it would be to leave unsaid. She was so forgetful of herself and so regardful of the sorrow about her that I held her in a sort of veneration. The work she did that day! There were so many things to be brought up from the beach and stored in the outhouse, as oars, nets, sails, cordage, spars, lobster pots, bags of ballast rendered, there being not a pair of working hands on all the shore but would have labored hard for Mr. Peggotty, and well paid in being asked to do it, yet she persisted all day long in toiling under weights that she was quite unequal to, and fagging to and fro on all sorts of unnecessary errands. As to deploring her misfortunes, she appeared to have entirely lost the recollection of ever having any. She preserved an equable cheerfulness in the midst of her sympathy, which was not the least astonishing part of the change that had come over her. Querulousness was out of the question. I wonder if that's related to the word quarrel, like fighting or arguing. I better look that one up. Querulousness? I don't think that's a word that anybody uses in modern English. I have no idea. Querulousness. The quality of being given to complaining. Yeah, so it's like arguing, complaining, fighting. I think it's probably related to the word quarrel. Querulousness was out of the question. I did not even observe her voice to falter, or a tear to escape from her eyes, the whole day through until twilight, when she and I and Mr. Peggotty, being alone together, and having fallen asleep in perfect exhaustion, she broke into a half-suppressed fit of sobbing and crying. Sobbing is very loud crying. She's always crying. She's always depressed. But she managed for a few days to suppress it, to keep it down, to suppress it. And taking me to the door, said, "Ever bless you, Master Davy. Be a friend to him, poor dear." Then she immediately ran out of the house to wash her face, in order that she might sit quietly beside him, and be found at work there, when he should awake. In short, I left her, when I went away at night, the prop and staff of Mr. Peggotty's affliction, and I could not meditate enough upon the lesson that I had read in Mrs. Gummidge, and the new experience she unfolded to me. It was between 9 and 10 o'clock when, strolling in a melancholy manner through the town, I stopped at Mr. Omer's door. Mr. Omer had taken it so much to heart, his daughter told me, that he had been very low and poorly all day, and had gone to bed without his pipe. "A deceitful, bad-hearted girl," said Mrs. Joram. "There was no good in her ever." "Don't say so," I returned. "You don't think so." "Yes, I do," cried Mrs. Joram angrily. "No, no," said I. Mrs. Joram tossed her head, endeavoring to be very stern and cross, but she could not command her softer self, and began to cry. I was young, to be sure, but I thought much the better of her for this sympathy, and fancied it became her. When something becomes somebody, that means it suits them, it's very much like them. So when she was trying to be angry, that didn't seem to fit her personality or the way that she looked. But the crying became her, meaning crying was much more suitable for her. It fit with her personality or the way that she looked more. And fancied it became her as a virtuous wife and mother very well indeed. "What will she ever do?" sobbed Minnie. "Where will she go? What will become of her? Oh, how could she be so cruel to tell herself and him?" I remembered the time when Minnie was a young and pretty girl, and I was glad she remembered it too, so feelingly. "My little Minnie," said Mrs. Joram, "has only just now been got to sleep. Even in her sleep she's sobbing for Emily. All day long little Minnie has cried for her, and asked me over and over again whether Emily was wicked. What can I say to her? When Emily tied a ribbon off her own neck round little Minnie's the last night she was here, and laid her head down on the pillow beside her till she was fast asleep. The ribbon's round my little Minnie's neck now. It ought not to be, perhaps, but what can I do? Emily is very bad, but they were fond of one another, and the child knows nothing." Mrs. Joram was so unhappy that her husband came out to take care of her. Leaving them together, I went home to Peggotty's, more melancholy myself, if possible, than I had been yet. The good creature, Peggotty, all untired by her late anxieties and sleepless nights, was at her brother's, where she meant to stay till morning. An old woman, who had been employed about the house for some weeks past while Peggotty had been unable to attend it, was the house's only other occupant besides myself. As I had no occasion for her services, I sent her to bed, by no means against her will, and sat down before the kitchen fire a little while to think about all of this. I was blending it with the deathbed of the late Mr. Barkis, and was driving out with the tide towards the distance at which Ham had looked so singularly in the morning. When you refer to someone as late, so for example Davy says the late Mr. Barkis, that means someone who has died. So he's sitting there thinking about this situation with Emily running away, and that's called eloping when you do that. Although I don't know if eloping means they got married. I don't think that they were getting married. So when she ran away with that boy, and so he was blending that because Peggotty's husband just died also. So he's got these two horrible things moving around in his head, and that's what he means when he says, "I was blending it with the deathbed of the late Mr. Barkis, and was driving out with the tide towards the distance at which Ham had looked so singularly in the morning, when I was recalled from my wanderings by a knock at the door. There was a knocker upon the door, but it was not that which made the sound. The tap was from a hand, and low down upon the door, as if it were given by a child. It made me start." We've seen that word start before. Start doesn't mean begin. Start means surprise, like move. This is starting. So maybe you've seen the word startled before, which means scared and surprised. That comes from the word start. To start is to do this movement. So it made me start, as much as if it had been knock of a footman to a person of distinction. I opened the door, and at first looked down, to my amazement, on nothing but a great umbrella that appeared to be walking about of itself. But I presently discovered, underneath it, Miss Mocher. I might not have been prepared to give the little creature a very kind reception. Now, Miss Mocher is a very strange character. She's a very small woman, a very tiny woman, maybe like 2 feet high. So I guess that would be, I don't know, like 60 centimeters high. She's very small. So that's why when Davy said, somebody knocked on the door, but they didn't use the knocker, it sounded like it must have been a little child, very low. And when he opened it, he looked down because he was sure it must be a child. And all he could see was an umbrella. But then when the umbrella moved, it was Miss Mocher, who really, she's just about, I guess, I don't know, 50 centimeters tall. She's a very, very small woman. I might not have been prepared to give the little creature a very kind reception if, on her removing the umbrella, which her utmost efforts were unable to shut up, she had shown me the volatile expression of face which had made so great an impression on me at our first and last meeting. But her face, as she turned it up to mine, was so earnest, so her face seemed kind of desperate. She had a desperate look on her face. And when I relieved her of her umbrella, which would have been an inconvenient one for the Irish giant... What does that mean? Which would have been an inconvenient one for the Irish giant? I don't know what that is a reference to. Irish giant. Well, I guess in the late 18th century, I guess there was a very tall person in Ireland, and he was called the Irish giant. So maybe because she was so small, she had a very special umbrella, and Davy was making a joke that would have not been a very suitable umbrella for the Irish giant. She wrung her little hands. This is, if you have wet clothes and you do this to your wet clothes, this is wringing your wet clothes. So wringing your hands would be like this. So she wrung her little hands in such an afflicted manner that I rather inclined towards her. "Miss Mocher," said I, after glancing up and down the empty street, without distinctly knowing what I expected to see besides. "How did you come here? What's the matter?" She motioned to me with her short right arm to shut the umbrella for her, and passing me hurriedly, went into the kitchen. When I had closed the door and followed with the umbrella in my hand, I found her sitting on the corner of the fender. It was a low iron one, with 2 flat bars at the top to stand plates upon, in the shadow of the boiler, swaying herself backwards and forwards, and chafing her hands upon her knees. Chafing is this movement, so she's doing this with her hands on her knees. Like a person in pain. Hadi says hello, it's 6 a.m. here. Wow, well, here it's 7 p.m., so good morning to you, and I guess good evening to me. "My dear young soul," returned Miss Mocher, squeezing her hands upon her heart, one over the other, "I am ill here. I am very ill. To think it should come to this, when I might have known it, perhaps, and prevented it, if I hadn't been a thoughtless fool." Again, her large bonnet, very disproportionate to the figure. So Miss Mocher, she's only about this big, but she's wearing a very large, like maybe a regular-sized woman's bonnet. So it looks kind of ridiculous on her. While a most gigantic bonnet rocked in unison with it, up and upon the wall. "I am surprised," I began, "to see you so distressed and serious," when she interrupted me. "Yes, it's always so," she said. "They're all surprised, these inconsiderate young people, fairly and full grown, to see any natural feeling in a little thing like me. They make a plaything of me, use me for their amusement, throw me away when they are tired, and wonder that I feel more than a toy horse, or a wooden horse. Yes, that's the way, the old way. "It may be with others," I returned, "but I do assure you it is not with me. Perhaps I ought not to be at all surprised to see you, as you are now. I know so little of you," I said, without consideration of what I thought. "What can I do?" returned the little woman, standing up and holding out her arms to show herself. "See? See what I am? My father was, my sister was, and my brother is. I have worked for sister and brother these many years. Hard, Mr. Copperfield, all day. I must live. I do no harm. If there are people so unreflecting or so cruel as to make a jest of me, what is left for me to do but make a jest of myself, them, and everything? If I do so for the time, whose fault is that? Mine." So, she's a very little woman. And she doesn't really, she knows Steerforth, the person that Emily ran away with, but she doesn't know Peggotty. She doesn't know Emily very well. So when she comes to Peggotty's house, that's a surprise. And Davy says, I'm surprised that you care this much. And she says, "Oh yes, everyone thinks because I'm so little, I'm like a toy, and I don't have feelings, especially young people. Young people are very mean to me. But of course I have feelings." So she's a little bit offended and angry. But I don't think that's what he meant when he said that he was surprised that she was so concerned. It's just that it's really none of her business. "No, not Miss Mocher's," I perceived. "If I had shown myself a sensitive dwarf to your false friend," pursued the little woman, shaking her head at me with reproachful earnestness, "how much of this help or goodwill do you think I should have ever had? If little Mocher, who had no hand, young gentleman, in the making of herself—" Okay, well, let me read that again. "Who had no hand," I think that means who had no help. So she's saying, if little Miss Mocher, who had no help, young gentleman, that's talking to Davy, in the making of herself, what she means by that is she's a very successful woman. She's this tall, but she has found a way to be useful to people and make a lot of money. So she's actually very successful. And that's what she means in making of herself. "Addressed herself to him, or the like of him, because of her misfortunes, when do you suppose her small voice would have been heard? Little Mocher would have as much need to live if she was the bitterest and dullest of pygmies. But she couldn't do it. No, she might whistle for her bread and butter till she died of air." Miss Mocher sat down on the fender again and took out her handkerchief and wiped her eyes. "Be thankful for me if you have a kind heart, as I think you have," she said, "that while I know well what I am, I can be cheerful and endure it all. I am thankful for myself, at any rate, that I can find my tiny way through the world, without being beholden to anyone. If you're beholden to someone, that means that you owe them something. Maybe you owe them a favor, maybe you owe them money, so you have to do what they say. That's what it means to be beholden to someone. So she's saying, okay, I may be very short, I may be a very small person, but I make a lot of money and I'm not beholden to anyone. I don't have to do what anyone tells me. I'm very independent. I don't owe anyone anything. And that in return for all that is thrown at me in folly or vanity as I go along. I can throw bubbles back. If I don't brood over all I want, it is better for me, and not the worse for anyone. If I am a plaything for you giants, be gentle with me. Miss Mocher replaced her handkerchief in her pocket, looking at me with very intent expression all the while, and pursued, I saw you in the street just now. You may suppose I am not able to walk as fast as you, with my short legs and short breath, and I couldn't overtake you, but I guessed where you came, and came after you. I have been here before, today, but the good woman wasn't at home. Do you know her? I demanded. Know of her. So if someone says, do you know this person? And you say, I know of that person, that means I know their name. I've heard the name before. I've heard people talk about that person, but we have never talked. We don't have any kind of connection. I know of her and about her, she replied, from Omer and Joram. I was there at 7 o'clock this morning. Do you remember what Steerforth said to me about this unfortunate girl, that time when I saw you both at the inn? The great bonnet on Miss Mocher's head, and the greater bonnet on the wall, began to go backwards and forwards again as she asked the question. I remembered very well what she referred to. Having had in my thoughts many times that day, I told her so. May the father of all evil confound him, said the little woman, holding up her forefinger between me and her sparkling eyes, and 10 times more confound that wicked servant. But I believed it was you who had a boyish passion for her. I? I repeated. Child, child, in the name of blind ill fortune, cried Miss Mocher, wringing her hands impatiently as she went to and fro upon the fender. Why did you praise her so and blush and look disturbed? I could not conceal from myself that I had done this, though for a reason very different from her supposition. What did I know? Said Miss Mocher, taking out her handkerchief again, and giving one little stamp on the ground whenever, at short intervals, she applied it to her eyes with both hands. Oh, giving a little stamp, stamping her feet. Stamping is like this movement, and I thought she was stamping her face with her handkerchief. But stamping your feet is like doing this with your feet, pressing very hard on the floor. She applied it to her eyes with both hands at once. He was crossing you and wheedling you, I saw, and you were soft wax in his hands, I saw. Had I left the room a minute, when his man told me that young innocence, so he called you, and you may call him old guilt all the days of your life, had set his heart upon her, and she was giddy and liked him, but his master was resolved that no harm should come of it, more for your sake than for hers. Oh, I'm a little bit confused now. All right, we have to go back and read this again. Sorry. Okay, let's start from what did I know? What did I know? Said Miss Mocher, taking out her handkerchief again and giving one little stamp on the ground whenever at short intervals she applied it to her eyes with both hands at once. He was crossing you and wheedling you, I saw, and you were soft wax in his hands, I saw. So there was one night when, the night that Davy met Miss Mocher, they were all talking, Steerforth, Davy, and Miss Mocher. And Miss Mocher had managed to make or embarrass Davy by saying, I know, you're in love with some girl. And I don't remember if he told her the name. But she's referring back to that thinking, yeah, we were all having fun talking about that, but Steerforth was getting that information from you, and when they discovered who it was, maybe that's what made him desire her. I'm not sure if that's what she's saying, but I think maybe that's what she's saying. Had I left the room a minute when his man told me that young innocence, so he called you, and you may call him old guilt, all the days of your life, had set his heart upon her. So his servant... Wait, had I left the room a minute... See, that means like if I had left the room, which means she didn't leave the room. So I'm a little bit confused by this. When his man told me, his man, that's his servant. When his man told me that young innocent, what is the name of the servant? I forgot his name. I can't think of it right now. But the servant told, that would be very strange for the servant to tell her that. Okay, I think I'm confused about this. Let's see. Had set his heart upon her. She was giddy and liked him, but his master was resolved that no harm should come of it, more for your sake than for hers. And that was their business here. And that was their business here? How could I but believe him? I saw Steerforth soothe and please you by his praise of her. You were the first to mention her name. You owned an old admiration of her. You were hot and cold, and red and white, and all at once I spoke to you of her. What could I think? What did I think? But that you were a young libertine in everything but experience, and had fallen into the hands that had experience enough, and could manage you, having the fancy for your own good. Oh, they were afraid of my finding out the truth, exclaimed Mrs. Mocher, getting off the fender and trotting up and down the kitchen with her two short arms distressfully lifted up. Well, that's a very complicated conversation, and I'm not really sure, but it seems like she's saying that the servant helped Steerforth's servant, the servant helped Steerforth get this girl, and that's what's really making her angry. I could be wrong about that, but that's what I think. It's very complicated. Because I'm a sharp little thing, I need be to get through the world at all, and they deceived me altogether, and I gave the poor unfortunate girl a letter. Oh, so actually they used her. The servant and Steerforth wrote a letter to Emily, and neither one of them, Steerforth is a friend of that family, but he couldn't go there and visit. That would be very suspicious. So they used, I don't know how it's not suspicious to have a 2-foot woman go and deliver the letter, but they had her go and deliver the letter, like a love letter to Emily. But she didn't know that she was being used in that way, and that's why she's angry. Which I fully believe was the beginning of her ever speaking to Litimer. Litimer is the name of the servant, who was left behind on purpose. I stood amazed at the revelation of all this perfidy. And we have to look up the word perfidy. Perfidy is deceitfulness, untrustworthiness. I stood amazed at the revelation of all this perfidy, looking at Miss Mocher as she walked up and down the kitchen until she was out of breath. When she sat down upon the fender again, and drying her face with her handkerchief, shook her head for a long time, without otherwise moving, and without breaking silence. My country rounds, she added at length, brought me to Norwich. To do rounds means if you have a job where part of your job is to go on a route, like a delivery, so maybe the mailman always takes the same way and delivers the mail to the same places in the neighborhood. Those are his rounds. So it's usually for a delivery person, like a milkman or a mailman. They always have the same route that they take, and those are your rounds. Or if you're a security If you're a security guard or a police officer, maybe every night you have to walk in a particular path. That's doing your rounds. So Miss Mocher, she does cosmetics. She does people's nails, and she gives them cosmetics for their faces to make them look younger or more attractive. And she has a list of very important, very wealthy clients. So she's successful. She's a successful woman. So when she says making my country rounds, that means she's visiting all of her customers, all of her regular customers in the country. My country rounds, she added at length, brought me to Norwich, Mr. Copperfield, the night before last. What I happened to find there about their secret way of coming and going without you, which was strange, led to my suspecting something wrong. I got into the coach, so she saw them in Norwich, I guess. And she said, oh, that's strange, that Emily and Steerforth are together without Davy. How did that happen? They're not friends. Led to my suspecting something wrong. I got into the coach from London last night, as it came through Norwich, and was here this morning. Oh, too late. Poor little Mocher turned so chilly after her crying and fretting that she turned round on the fender, putting her poor little wet feet in among the ashes to warm them, and sat looking at the fire like a large doll. I sat in a chair on the other side of the hearth, lost in unhappy reflections, and looking at the fire too, and sometimes at her. I must go, she said at last, rising as she spoke. It's late. You don't mistrust me? Meeting her sharp glance, which was as sharp as ever when she asked me, I could not, on that short challenge, answer no quite frankly. Come, she said, accept the offer of my hand to help her over the fender, and looked wistfully up at my face. You know you wouldn't mistrust me if I was a full-sized woman. I felt that there was much truth in this, and I felt rather ashamed of myself. You're a young man, she said, nodding. Take a word of advice, even from the 3-foot nothing. Okay, so she's 3 feet tall, so she's like a meter. That's like a meter tall. Try not to associate bodily defects with mental, my good friend, except for a solid reason. She had got over the fender, and I had got over my suspicion. I told her that I believed she had given me a faithful account of herself, and that we had both been hapless instruments in designing hands, and she thanked me, and said I was a good fellow. Now mind, she exclaimed, turning back on her way to the door and looking shrewdly at me, with her forefinger up again. I have some good reason to suspect from what I have heard. My ears are always open. I can't afford to spare what powers I have, that they are gone abroad. But if ever they return, if ever any one of them returns, while I am alive, I am more likely than another, going about as I do, to find out soon. Whatever I know, you shall know. If ever I can do anything to serve the poor betrayed girl, I will do it faithfully. Please heaven. And Littimer had better have a bloodhound at his back, than little Mocher. So she's saying it's better if a dog is chasing Littimer than me, because I'll kill him. I placed implicit faith in this last statement when I marked the look with which it was accompanied. Trust me no more, but trust me no less than you would trust a full-sized woman, said the little creature, touching me appealingly on the wrist. If ever you see me again, unlike what I am now, and like what I was when you first saw me, observe what company I am in. Call to mind that I am a very helpless and defenseless little thing. think of me at home with my mother, like myself, and sister, like myself, when my day's work is done. Perhaps you won't, then, be very hard upon me, or surprised, if I can be distressed and serious. Good night. I gave Miss Mocher my hand, with a very different opinion of her that which I had hitherto entertained, and opened the door to let her out. It was not a trifling business to get the great umbrella up, and properly balanced in her grasp. But at last I successfully accomplished this, and saw it go bobbing. Bobbing means moving up and down. So he couldn't see her because she's so small and the umbrella is so big, but he could see the umbrella bobbing up and down, moving down the street. Bobbing down the street through the rain, without the least appearance of having anybody underneath, except when a heavier fall than usual from some overcharged waterspout sent it toppling over on one side, and discovered Miss Mocher struggling violently to get it right. After making one or two sallies to her relief, which were rendered futile by the umbrella's hopping on again, like an immense bird, before I could reach it, I came in, went to bed, and slept till morning. In the morning I was joined by Mr. Peggotty and by my old nurse, and we went and at an early hour to the coach office, where Mrs. Gummidge and Ham were waiting to take leave of us. "Master Davy," Ham whispered, drawing me aside, while Mr. Peggotty was stowing his bag. To stow something means to place something up high for storage. Stow, store, you can see the connection. So actually when you go on an airplane, they say, stow your bags above you. Stow your bags in the, what is that called? The overhead compartment. They use that word stow when you're doing that. So Mr. Peggotty is stowing his bags on the coach. He's stowing his bags on the coach. And while he's doing that, Ham takes him and says, "Master Davy." His life is quite broke up. He don't know where he's going. Don't know what afore him. He's bound upon a voyage that'll last on and off all the rest of his days. Take my word for it. Unless he finds what he's seeking of, I'm sure you'll be a friend of him, Master Davy. So Ham is saying, Mr. Peggotty, he doesn't know what he's doing. He doesn't know where he's going or how to find her. And he'll continue traveling on for the rest of his days until he finds Emily. And so Ham is saying, try to help him whenever you can. And Davy says, "Trust me, I will indeed," I said, shaking hands with Ham earnestly. Thank ye very kind, sir. One thing furder, I'm in good employ, you know, Master Davy, and I han't no way now o' spending what I gets." "Money's of no use to me no more, except to live. If you can lay it out for him, I shall do my work with a better art. Though as to that, sir," and he spoke very steadily and mildly, "you're not to think but I shall work at all times like a man, and act best that lays in my power." So I think he's saying, I'm making a lot of money that I don't need, now that my fiancée has run away with another man. So all I need is money for food, and I make pretty good money. So if he needs money now, give him money. He didn't say this exactly, but I think this is what he was implying. Give Mr. Peggotty whatever money you can give him, and I will pay for it later. I told him I was as well convinced of it, and I hinted that I hoped that time might even come when he would cease to lead the lonely life he naturally contemplated now. "No, sir," he said, shaking his head, "all that's past and over with me, sir. No one can never fill the place that's empty, but you'll bear in mind about the money, as there's at all times some laying by for him. So he's saying, well, Davy's saying, come on, don't be so dramatic. Emily will come back to you, or you'll find somebody else. He says, nope, no, I'm finished with that. But just make sure that Mr. Peggotty has enough money to do what he's doing. Reminding him of the fact that Mr. Peggotty's derived a steady, though certainly very moderate income from the bequest of his late brother-in-law, I promised him to do so. Uh-oh, my voice is going. So when his brother-in-law died, he left him some money. Actually, not a bad amount of money. But he said, but anyway, if he needs money, I'll always make sure he has money. We then took leave of each other. I cannot leave him even now without remembering what a pang at once his modest fortitude and his great sorrow. As to Mrs. Gummidge, if I were to endeavor to describe how she ran down the street by the side of the coach, seeing nothing but Mr. Peggotty on the roof, through the tears she tried to repress, and dashing herself against the people who were coming in the opposite direction, I should enter on a task of some difficulty. Therefore, I had better leave her sitting on a baker's doorstep, out of breath, with no shape at all remaining in her bonnet, and one of her shoes off, lying on the pavement at considerable distance. So Mrs. Gummidge was so upset when they were leaving on the coach that she ran after it as fast as she could, and she was hitting people and bumping into people. She lost one of her shoes, and finally she was so tired that she just had to sit down in front of a shop and start crying. When we got to our journey's end, our first pursuit was to look about for a little lodging for Peggotty, where her brother could have a bed. We were so fortunate as to find one of very clean and cheap description over a chandler's shop, only 2 streets removed from me. When we had engaged this domicile, I bought some cold meat at an eating-house and took my fellow travelers home to tea, a proceeding, I regret to state, which did not meet with Mrs. Crupp's approval, but quite the contrary, I ought to observe, however, in explanation that lady's state of mind, that she was much offended by Peggotty's tucking up her window's gown before she had been 10 minutes in the place, and setting to work to dust my bedroom. This Mrs. Crupp regarded in light of a liberty, and a liberty, she said, was a thing that she never allowed. So Mrs. Crupp, who's the landlady of the house where Davy rents his apartment, she's supposed to clean and keep things very nice, but she's a very lazy woman, and she likes to drink a lot of alcohol. And she doesn't do it. And if you ask her to do work, she'll complain and say, oh, I don't feel well today, and things like that. So when Peggotty, who has taken care of Davy since he was a baby, comes into the building, she starts straightening things out and dusting his apartment, and Mrs. Crupp is very offended by this. Mr. Peggotty had made a communication to me on the way to London, for which I was not unprepared. It was that he proposed first meeting Mrs. Steerforth. As I felt bound to assist him in this, and also to mediate between them, with the view of sparing the mother's feelings as much as possible, I wrote to her that night, and I told her as mildly as I could what his wrong was, and what my own share in his injury. I said that he was a man in a very common life, but of a most gentle and upright character, and that I ventured to express a hope mentioned 2 o'clock in the afternoon as the hour of our coming, and I sent the letter myself by the first coach in the morning. So the first thing that Mr. Peggotty wanted to do when he arrived in London was see Steerforth's mother. And she's a very wealthy woman, and he's a very simple, poor kind of man. And she loves her son. She cannot conceive or ever think that her son would ever do anything wrong. So I don't think that she'll agree to meet with him because he's poor and she's rich, but also because she has like 100% faith in her son, and there's just no way that she could ever hear her son doing something so wrong. So it would be interesting to see how she reacts to this, or if she even agrees to see them. At the appointed time, we stood at the door of that house where I had been a few days since, so happy, where my youthful confidence and warmth of heart had been yielded up so freely, which was closed against me henceforth, which was now a waste, a ruin. No Littimer appeared. The pleasanter face which had replaced his on the occasion of my last visit answered to our summons and went before us to the drawing-room. Mrs. Steerforth was sitting there. Rosa Dartle glided as we went in front from another part of the room and stood beside her chair. I saw directly in his mother's face that she knew from himself what he had done. It was very pale, and bore the traces of a deeper emotion than my letter alone, weakened by the doubts of her fondness, would have raised upon it. Oh, let me read that again. It was very pale, and bore the traces of deeper emotion than my letter alone, weakened by the doubts her fondness would have raised upon it, would have been likely to create. I thought her more like him than ever I had thought her, and I felt, rather than saw, the resemblance was not lost on my companion. She sat upright in her armchair, with a stately, immovable, passionless air. To be stately means to be like a very important, like a king or a queen, or like a president or something, sitting in a very impressive way, the way that a king or a queen would sit. She looked very steadfastly at Mr. Peggotty when he stood before her, and looked quite steadfastly at her. Rosa Dartle's keen glance comprehended all of us. For some moments not a word was spoken. She motioned to Mr. Peggotty to be seated. He said in a low voice, "I shouldn't feel it natural, ma'am, to sit down in this house. I'd sooner stand." And this was succeeded by another silence, which she broke thus. "I know, with deep regret, what has brought you here. What do you want of me? What do you ask of me to do?" He put his hat under his arm, and feeling in his breast for Emily's letter, so he's looking for Emily's letter, took it out, unfolded it, and gave it to her. "Please to read that, ma'am. That's my niece's hand." She read it, in the same stately, impassive way, untouched by its contents as far as I could see, and returned it to him. "Unless he brings me back a lady," said Mr. Peggotty, tracing out the parts with his finger. So, "Unless he brings me back a lady, I come to know, ma'am, whether he will keep his word." So he's saying, she's saying, "I will never return unless he marries me." And so Mr. Peggotty is quoting that. "Unless he brings me back a lady, unless he goes and marries me so there's no more scandal." And so Mrs. Steerforth says, "No," she returned. "Why not?" said Mr. Peggotty. "It's impossible. He would disgrace himself. You cannot fail to know that she is far below him." "Raise her up," said Mr. Peggotty. "She's uneducated and ignorant." "Maybe she's not. Maybe she is," said Mr. Peggotty. "I think not, ma'am, but I'm no judge of them things. Teach her better." "Since you oblige me to speak more plainly, which I'm very unwilling to do, her humble connections would render such a thing impossible, if nothing else did." So he's saying it's impossible. She would never let her son marry Emily because she's so poor and uneducated and ignorant. "Hark to this, ma'am," he returned slowly and quietly. "You know what it is to love your child. So do I. If she was 100 times my child, I couldn't love her more. You don't know what it is to lose your child. I do. All the heaps of riches in the world would be naught to me if they was mine to buy her back. But save her from this disgrace, and she shall never be disgraced by us. Not one of us that she's growed up among, not one of us that she's lived along with her and had her for their all in all these many year, will ever look upon her pretty face again. We'll be content to let her be. We'll be content to think of her far off, as if she was some underneath another sun and sky. We'll be content to trust her to her husband." So Mr. Peggotty is saying, "Look, I understand that you would be ashamed of us. We understand. We're poor. You don't want to do anything with us. But just let him marry her, and we'll never see her again. We'll never visit her. We'll never contact her. You can have her, but please just save her from this." Hamilton says hello. Hello, Hamilton. Thank you for joining us tonight. "And bide by the time when all of us shall be alike in the quality afore our God." The rugged eloquence in which he spoke was not devoid of all effect. She still preserved her proud manner, but there was a touch of softness in her voice as she answered, "I justify nothing. I make no counter-accusations, but I'm sorry to repeat, it's impossible. Such a marriage would irretrievably blight my son's career and ruin his prospects. Nothing is more certain than it never can take place, and never will. If there's any other compensation..." So she's saying, "Well, can I give you some money? He can't marry her. That's impossible. Maybe I can give you some money." "I am looking at the likeness of the face," interrupted Peggotty, "with a steady but kindling eye, that has looked at me in my home, at my fireside, in my boat. We're not." So he's saying, because she looks just like her son. So he's saying, right now I'm looking at that same face that was my friend, who spent this summer with me and my family, and then who stole my niece. Peggotty, with a steady but kindling eye, that has looked at me in my home, at my fireside, in my boat, we're not, smiling and friendly, and when it was so treacherous that I go half wild, I think, when I think of it. If the likeness of that face don't turn to burning fire at the thought of offering money to me for my child's blight and ruin, it's as bad. I don't know, being a lady's. But what it's worse..." Okay, it's kind of hard to figure out what he's saying, but he's saying, when I see your face, I see his face, because they look the same. And now, you're this fine lady. How on earth could you try to offer me money to go away for this? That's pretty much what he's saying, but it's a little bit, even for me, it's pretty difficult to understand exactly what he's saying. She changed now, in a moment, An angry flush overspread her features, and she said, in an intolerant manner, grasping the armchair tightly with her hands, "What compensation can you make to me for opening such a pit between me and my son? What is your love to mine? What is your separation to ours?" So now she's saying, oh, and what's my compensation? Compensation means you pay for something somehow. It doesn't have to be money. But compensation means like you make two things that are unequal equal. So if you work hard to make things equal, you deserve compensation, usually money. So compensation is trying to make things equal or balanced. And Mr. Peggotty's insulted. How can you offer me money to make me go away? I don't want money. I want my daughter back, or I want my niece back. And she's saying, what about my compensation? Now my son's reputation is ruined forever because of your dirty little niece. Miss Dartle softly touched her and bent down her head to whisper, but she would not hear a word. "No, Rosa, not a word. Let the man listen to what I say. My son, who has been the object of my life, to whom it is every thought that has been devoted, whom I have gratified from a child in every wish, from whom I have no separate existence since his birth, to take up in a moment with a miserable girl and avoid me, to repay my confidence with systematic deception for her sake, and quit me for her?" So she's insulted that her son ruined their relationship, his relationship with his mother, to take Emily, this poor girl. "To set this wretched fancy against his mother's claims upon his duty, love, respect, gratitude, claims that every day and hour of his life should have strengthened into his ties that nothing could be proof against. Is this no injury?" Again, Rosa Dartle tried to soothe her. Soothing means calm, like, calm down, shh, it's okay. Hamilton says, where can I find the other chapters? Well, they're on my channel in the live section. So right now we're on chapter 32. And somebody was saying today that they couldn't find chapter 1. So I have to go and look. I'm sure it's there. It has to be there. But you can definitely find them on my channel in the live section. I started making a playlist, but I've neglected it for a while. But I think the first maybe 15 or 16 chapters are in that playlist. Again, Rosa Dartle tried to soothe her. That's like, shh, calm down, it's okay. Again, ineffectually, but it didn't work. "I say, Rosa, not a word. If he can take his all upon the lightest object, I can stake my..." Oh, let me read that again. "If he can stake his all upon the lightest object, I can stake my all upon a greater purpose. Let him go where he will, with the means that my love has secured to him. Does he think to reduce me by long absence? He knows his mother very little if he does. Let him put away his whim now, and he is welcome back. Let him not put her away now, and he never shall come near me, living or dying, while I can raise my hand to make a sign against it, unless being rid of her for ever, he comes humbly to me and begs for my forgiveness." So she's very angry with her son for doing this. And she's saying, I don't care, he can go out and have his fun, but when he comes back, and he will come back one day, he better not bring her with, because if he brings her with, I won't talk to him. But if he abandons her, I'll forgive him. This is my right. This is the acknowledgement I will have. This is the separation that there is between us. And is this, she added, looking at her visitor, with the proud, intolerant air with which she had begun, no injury? While I heard and saw her mother as she said these words, I seemed to hear and see the sun defying them. all that I had ever seen in him was an unyielding, willful spirit. I saw in her all the understanding that I had now of his misdirected energy became an understanding of her character too, and a perception that it was, in its strongest springs, the same. So this fire that he suddenly sees in the mother reminds him of many times that he spent with Steerforth and saw that same kind of energy. She now observed me aloud, resuming her former restraint, that it was useless to hear more, or to say more, and that she begged to put an end to this interview. She rose with an air of dignity to leave the room when Mr. Peggotty signified that it was needless. "Don't fear me being any hindrance to you. I have no more to say, ma'am," he remarked, as he moved towards the door. "I come beer with no hope, and I take away no hope. I have done what I thought should be done, but I never looked for any good to come of my standing where I do. This has been too evil a house for me and mine, for me to be in my right senses, and I expect it." With this we departed, leaving her standing by her elbow chair, a picture of a noble presence and a handsome face. We had on our way out to cross the paved hall with glass sides and roof, over which a vine was trained. Its leaves and shoots were green. And then, the day being sunny, a pair of glass doors leading to the garden were thrown open. Rosa Dartle, entering this way with a noiseless step, when we were close to them, addressed herself to me. "You do well," she said, "indeed, to bring this fellow here. Such a concentration of rage and scorn as darkened her face and flashed in her jet black eyes, I could not have thought compressible even into that face." So Rosa Dartle, Mrs. Steerforth's friend, is very angry. And she says, "I can't believe you brought him here." And he's never seen anyone look so angry as she looks. The scar made by the hammer was, as usual, in this excited state of her features, strongly marked. When the throbbing is like this, boom, 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 boom. You know, if you hit your hand with something and then you feel that pulse, boom, 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 that's throbbing. When the throbbing I had seen before came into as I looked at her, she absolutely lifted her hand and struck it. "This is a fellow," she said, "to champion and bring here, is he not? You are a true man." "Miss Dartle," I returned, "you are surely not so unjust as to condemn me." "Why do you bring division between these two mad creatures?" she returned. "Don't you know that they are both mad with their own self-will and pride?" "Is it my doing?" I returned. So she's saying, "Why did you bring him here?" And Davy's saying, "Why are you angry with me?" And she says, "You know that Steerforth's mother and Steerforth are not very sensible people." "Is it your doing?" she retorted. "Why do you bring this man here?" "He is a deeply injured man, Miss Dartle," I replied. "You may not know it." "I know that James Steerforth," she said, with her hand on her bosom. This is your bosom here. "I know that James Steerforth, with her hand on her bosom, as if to prevent the storm that was raging there from being loud, has a false, corrupt heart, and is a traitor. But what need I know or care about this fellow and his common niece?" So she's saying, yeah, I know he's horrible, but I still don't care about these two people, these two poor people. "Miss Dartle," I returned, "you deepen the injury. It is sufficient already. I will only say at parting that you do him a great wrong." "I do him no wrong," she returned. "They are a depraved, worthless set. I would have her whipped." Oh, gosh. Mr. Peggotty passed on without a word, and went out at the door. "Oh, shame, Miss Dartle, shame!" I said indignantly. "How can you bear to trample on this undeserved affliction?" "I would trample on them all," she answered. "I would have his house pulled down. I would have her branded on the face, dressed in rags, and cast out into the streets to starve. If I had the power to sit in judgment on her, I would see it done. See it done. I would do it. I detest her, even if detest is really strong hate. I detest her, if ever I could reproach her with her infamous condition. I would go anywhere to do so. If I could hunt her to her grave, I would. If there was any word of comfort that would be a solace to her in her dying hour, and only I possessed it, I wouldn't part with it for life itself." The mere vehemence of her words can convey, I'm sensible, but a weak impression of the passion by which she was possessed, and which made itself articulate in her whole figure, though her voice, instead of being raised, was lower than usual. No description I could give of her would do justice to my recollection of her, or to her entire deliverance of herself to her anger. I have seen passion in many forms, but I have never seen it in such a form as that. When I joined Mr. Peggotty, he was walking slowly and thoughtfully down the hill. He told me, as soon as I came up with him, that having now discharged his mind of what he had purposed doing in London, he meant to set out on his travels. Well, set out is a phrasal verb which means to start a big journey. And Mr. Peggotty has an enormous journey, because it seems as though Steerforth and Emily have run away to another country. But Mr. Peggotty has no idea where or how to find her. He doesn't know if she's in London or some other place. So he's got to search the whole world for his niece. And that's why it says to set out on his travels, to start this enormous journey, this enormous trip. I asked him where he meant to go, and he only answered, "I'm a-goin', sir, to seek my niece." We went back to the little lodging over the chandler's shop, and there I found an opportunity of repeating to Peggotty what he had said to me. She informed me in return that he had said the same to her that morning. She knew no more than I did where he was going, but she thought he had some project shaped out in his mind. I did not like to leave him under such circumstances, and we all three dined together off of beefsteak pie, which was one of the many good things for which Peggotty was famous, and which was curiously flavored on this occasion, I recollect well, by a miscellaneous taste of tea, coffee, butter, bacon, cheese, new loaves, firewood, candles, and walnut ketchup, continually ascending from the shop. After dinner, we sat for an hour or so near the window, without talking much, and then Mr. Peggotty got up, brought his oilskin bag and his stout stick, and laid them on the table. He accepted from his sister's stock of ready money a small sum on account of his legacy, barely enough, I should have thought, to keep him for a month. He promised to communicate with me when anything befell him, and he slinging is when you go like this. This is slinging. So he slung. He slung his bag about him, took his hat and his stick, and bade us both goodbye. "All good attend you, dear old woman," he said, embracing Peggotty, "and you too, Master Davy," shaking hands with me. "I'm a-goin' to seek her for fur and wide. If she should come home while I'm away, but that ain't like to be. Or if I should bring her back, my meaning is, and she and me shall live and die where no one can't reproach her. If any hurt should come to me, remember that the last words I left for her was, my unchanged love is with my darling child, and I forgive her. He said this solemnly, bareheaded. Then, bare means naked, so he took off his hat when he said this. He said it naked-headed, bareheaded. So that's like kind of a sign of respect when you take off your hat. And then putting on his hat, he went down the stairs and away. We followed to the door. It was warm, a dusty evening, just the time when in the great main thoroughfare out of which that byway turned, there was a temporary lull in the eternal tread of foot upon the pavement, and a strong red sunshine. He turned alone at the corner out of our shady street into a glow of light in which we lost him. Rarely did that hour of the evening come. Rarely did I wake at night. Rarely did I look up at the moon or stars, or watch the falling rain, or hear the wind. But I thought of his solitary figure toiling on, poor pilgrim, and recalled the words, I'm going to seek her fur and wide. If any hurt should come to me, remember the last words I left for her was, my unchanged love is with my darling child, and I forgive her. All right, well, that was chapter 32 of David Copperfield by Charles Dickens. So next time, hopefully I won't be lazy tomorrow, and I'll do it at the same time tomorrow, but sometimes I get tired by this time of night. So I will try to do it tomorrow night. But thank you for staying and watching, and thank you for commenting and questioning. And I do hope that you come back when we read chapter 33 of David Copperfield by Charles Dickens.